The cold was a living thing tonight. It crept under furs and leather, bit through wool and mail, settled its weight upon bone until every breath rattled like a thin icicle. Benjen Stark moved through it as one moves through unseen water, shoulders squared beneath the black of the watch, his hood rimed with frost. The haunted forest watched him with 1,000 eyes that were not eyes at all. Knots and hollows, frost-glazed branches, the breath of a half-buried weirwood root whispering beneath the crust of snow. His mare's breath smoked in steady plumes, the only warmth between him and the white wilderness. Somewhere far off a dire wolf called, the sound thin as thread. He had been beyond the wall for 7 nights and half as many days, tracking signs that never held still long enough to wear a face. Once he had found a set of prints, human at first glance. Barefoot, no toes, no heel, half an inch deep despite the cold. Moving with a hunter's care around a tangle of spruce, then vanishing into a patch of wind-smoothed snow that looked as innocent as milk. He had knelt and pressed his hand upon that milk and felt nothing but cold. He had turned back at dusk and the prince had followed him for a mile, each step appearing in the track of his own in a way that mocked the living. He had not loosed an arrow. It would have been as good as praying at a burned weirwood. Benjen had not prayed in years, though sometimes he spoke to the wind as if it understood him. Tonight he said only, "Not much farther, girl," to the mare, and the mare flicked an ear and set her hooves where his knees guided. There was smoke ahead. He smelled it before he saw it, smoke mingled with pitch and meat and the sweet, wrong scent of something rotten. The trees gave way by slow degrees, and the night opened into a clearing ringed with black stumps and half-burned saplings, where a crude hall hunched like a beast with its ribs showing. The timbers were old, the roof patched with hides and nailed planks, the door a piece from some shattered ship. Snow lay melted in a ring around the fire pit, and women moved in the half-light with their heads bowed and their arms tucked close. Craster's Keep. The name lived like a burr in the fur of any ranging. Benjen drew rein in the tree's shadow and watched. He came here because the smoke here always told of meat in winter, and women, and the sort of man whose bargains were paid by those who could not speak to refuse. He came because crows fed on carrion and carrion drew wolves and other, colder scavengers. He came because his world was shrinking. To maintain the wall you had to know what pressed against it. A door creaked. A man stepped out, bearded and wide-bellied, gray-haired, eyes small as currants. Craster wore a necklace of bones and teeth and a knife at his belt carven from antler. Another followed, older, limping, carrying a pail that smoked. The wind made a toy of the fire's smoke and flung it in thin veils toward the trees. Benjen slid from the saddle and led the mare behind a tangle of deadfall, tying her silent with hands that remembered. His fingers had long learned to be their own lamps. He worked his way along the edge of shadow, boots sinking to the ankle at times, the crust breaking with a soft crack like a muffled gasp. He watched the hall and the dark behind it. He counted figures by their steps and their work. 5 women by the fire, 3 men besides Craster within and without, 2 boys with the wrong stillness about them, as if carved from hard wax. There was a sound within the hall. Not a cry, but the aftercolor of a cry, something that seemed to stain his hearing. Benjen set his teeth. He had heard that sound before under other roofs and had done nothing but look down into his cup. That had been a dozen winters past, and duty had been a thing with cleaner edges then. He remembered Ned's mouth when he said, "Leave the South to Southerners. Ben, defend what is yours to defend." He remembered Lionel's hands at his hair when he was small, gentle, and merciless. Craster came back to the door with something small wrapped in rough hide. He called to the wind, and the women by the fire fell to stillness, and the men beyond them turned their faces as if afraid to see. He held the bundle high and spoke in a language that had never belonged to the watch. Benjen moved, and the snow swallowed his steps. "What bargain is that?" he asked from 10 paces off. Craster's arm dropped at once. He turned his head like a boar sniffing blood. The bundle stirred, and a sound like a hiccup came from it, and one of the women made a half-step and folded in upon herself. "Who's there?" said Craster, though the black upon Benjen's shoulders could not be mistaken for anything else in that clearing. The man with the smoking pail sucked his teeth. A boy's eyes rolled white as his face. "Benjen Stark," Benjen said. "First Ranger of the Night's Watch." The old title felt like a coat he had once worn and now found tight through the arms. But he wore it. Not one man moved. "I'll take bread and salt if you have it," he added. "And talk after," Craster spat. "You'll take what I give you, Crow." He sniffed the wind as if it would tell him whether the night bit and where. His hand shifted on the bundle. "You and yours come here too often, black brother. Eating my pigs, eyeing my wives." The word wives fell cold as stones. "Go piss off a cliff." Benjen let the silence stand until it felt like a rope drawn taut, then said, "There's movement in the high land, not just raiders. I'll have my watchfires burning, but I don't care to see this roof burning behind me when I turn back. I need to know if you've seen men marching under a red hand." Craster snorted. "The thens ain't fools enough to show banners. You want to know what I saw? I saw the wind strip the skin off a dead man and wear it better'n he ever did. I saw a bear with eyes like blue stars look through a man the way a man looks through water. I saw." "Enough," Benjen said. He reached into his cloak and pulled out a tight-wrapped skin of ale and offered it. For a heartbeat, Craster's eyes were only eyes, greedy and mean. He jerked his chin toward the door. Benjen stepped forward. The bundle in Craster's arms made no sound at all now. He might have done it differently on another night. He might have held his tongue, eaten his stew, listened as the bones cracked in Craster's teeth. He might have ridden away before dawn with a scrap more knowledge and a scrap more rot in him. But the cold was in his bones, and the forest had offered him nothing for 7 days but the shape of what pressed against the world. And he was tired of being the crow who ate and closed his eyes and told himself the world was as it must be. "What's in the hide?" he asked quietly. Craster's lip lifted. "None of your say." Benjen took a breath. "Everything here is my say." Came out softer than he thought it would. "You know what I keep out. You know what I keep in. Give me the child, Craster." At the word child, the women moved, not toward him, but as if they could put their bodies between the wind and something the wind had already taken. Craster hissed like a kettle. "You take your black and go," he said. "You can't have what I give. I've kept this roof up in a world that wants to crush it. You break my bargain, Stark, and I'll feed you to what you think you can keep out." His fingers tightened on the bundle, and the old man with the pail raised it as if it were a shield. Benjen stepped closer. "Give me the child," he said again. Craster's knife was in his hand like a trout flashing out of a stream. Benjen saw the arm twitch, saw the glint of antler, and caught the wrist in his left hand. The knife hissed past his ribs and tore his cloak. Benjen twisted. Bone cracked under his fingers like ice. Craster screamed, and the bundle fell, and Benjen dropped with it and found a face in the hide, wet and slick and blind. He gathered it close without thinking, breath shaking in his throat. Something moved at the tree line, something that bent the air. He did not turn toward it. He rose with the child in his arms and said, "Inside." No one moved. The women gazed as if he had plucked a coal with his bare hand. The boy with the white eyes swallowed and looked past Benjen to the trees again. "Inside," Benjen said, and this time it was a command. The women went. The old man with the pail shuffled backward, the smoke from his pail making lazy black fingers that curled and died. Craster cradled his broken wrist and showed his teeth like a dog. "You bring it under my roof, it's my son," he panted. Hate made his face young. It took 20 winters from him and left nothing but a bared blade. "You can't keep a bargain once broke, Crow. You can't sleep through a night you've woken." "I'm tired of sleeping," Benjen said. He passed under the lintel with the bundle close to him, and the heat inside hit his bones like a blow. The space was low, smoky, hung with skins and herbs and bones. A stew pot bubbled on a hook over the fire. Someone would come to take the child. Someone always did. Tonight they would not. He bent and set the bundle by the hearth and peeled back the hide. The baby's lips were blue at the corners. Its fingers were curled once against its chest as if they had already learned shame. He slid a hand under the child's head and pressed a thumb over its sternum, rubbing. He leaned close and breathed on the tiny mouth. "Come on now," he muttered, looking briefly at his own hand as if it belonged to another, a hand that had not held a son or daughter of his blood. The baby opened its mouth and pulled a ragged breath that had to tear a path into life. A thin cry followed, raw and furious. The sound knotted something between his shoulder blades. He straightened and found a woman's gaze on him, and in it a grief so familiar he wanted to cover the hearth with snow and smother the fire. "Put the roof between you and what's coming," he said to all of them and none of them. "Bar the door. Keep wood for the night. I'll sit." Craster's keep survived the night. He made it do so by standing between the door and the sense that pressed at it, that patient, soft knocking that had nothing to do with fingers. When he left at dawn, the child was asleep. Craster's men glared and Craster spat blood into the snow and cradled his ruined wrist, and the wind sang a high, thin song. There were no prints in the clearing. There were prints north of it, 11 sets of them, all the right shape, all too light, marching toward the shadows. Benjen rode for the wall. He did not drive the mare hard. He rode with the sense of something having shifted on its axis. He had been a man who held lines and mended what frayed. Today he had cut, felt better than he had expected and worse. From Eastwatch he sent a raven to Castle Black and another to the Shadow Tower. From the first he asked for fires to be lit along the switchback road and oil kept hot and stones stacked high. From the second he asked for fresh eyes in the gorge and reports by noon and dusk of any sign on the high tracks. From both he asked, as he always did, that dead brothers and dead enemies be burned bare minutes after their last breath. He wrote the letters himself. He did not trust any words not set down by his hand. The wall rose ahead of him as a cliff of impossible sky, blue and white and blue again where the light caught. It was a thing men called a wall because no other word would do, though it was no more like a wall than a mountain was like a man. He felt for it like a half-remembered song in his breastbone, and when the gates opened at the end of the long tunnel he felt something else. Relief so deep it was almost shame. They were drilling in the yard. The clang of steel on steel rang between stone and ice, and the breath of boys new come from south of the wall steamed upward like prayer. Ser Alicer stalked among them with his lash of a tongue, flicking it to make them jump, for there was not enough leather left by winter to waste on lashes. A dozen boys moved as if they had learned to move before they could stand. Another dozen moved like scarecrows. The tallest of the first dozen, a lean, dark-haired youth with a face that had not yet resolved into the man beneath it, turned to follow Benjen with his eyes as he crossed the yard. He kept his face blank when Alicer cuffed his ear and snapped at him to watch his point. "Uncle," the boy said when he could. It was not shouted. It did not need to be. "John," Benjen answered. They made time for each other as men make time for the bone they must set before it heals wrong. After the boys were dismissed and the yard swept, they walked along the inner wall together, the wind knifing at their cheeks and the ice shedding a faint, dry glitter. Benjen listened more than he spoke. Before he had gone on this ranging, he had not done so well with listening to this boy. Jon Snow was hard not to love, as boys went, stubborn and bright and hungry for a place, and that hunger rode him hard enough to make him overreach. Benjen had taken him to task for it with a sharpness that had felt justified and afterward only felt like a man striking at a thorn to make his thumb stop bleeding. "There's a fat boy in the commons," Jon reported at once, earnest as if he had saved him up for a better wind. "He's soft as butter and frightened of his own shadow. Alicer will break him for sport." "Then don't let Alicer," Benjen said. Jon set his jaw. "He's set over me." "Only in the yard," Benjen said. "Elsewhere your courage will have to do. Can you share it? Or is it no good unless it makes a show with steel?" "I can share it," Jon said after a breath. Ghost patted at his heel, white on white, eyes red as fresh blood. The direwolf silence had always unnerved the brothers who had never seen such a thing. It comforted Benjen, though he could not have said why. He had heard wolves his whole life. It was a different sort of quiet to carry your wildness inside you. "Good," Benjen said. He reached to touch the wolf's head, and Ghost accepted it with a dignity that said he permitted it. Another thing, Benjen added, and John's shoulders went tighter, ready for the rebuke. If you are ever told to leave a child to die because it is simple, refuse. If you are told to hold a line that looks clean but smears blood you can keep from smearing, refuse. If you are told your vows make you blind, refuse. John stared at him. My vows are my sight, he said softly, echoing words he had been taught and believed. They are, Benjen agreed, and your vows have a heart. Keep it beating. Help it see. He did not explain. He was not sure he could. Lord Commander Mormont wants to see you at once, a voice called down. It belonged to Bowen Marsh, the Lord Steward, a man with the look of an apple left too long in a cellar shrunk, stubbornly sweet. His nose was red with the cold, and his breath smoked white. There's word from Cotter Pike and Eastwatch. There's word and there's worry. Worry is what we keep, Benjen said in answer and went. Gior Mormont sat with his bare shoulders hunched over a map, the knuckles of his right hand pale. There was less of his hair than before Benjen had ridden out and more of his temper. He did not stand to greet the first ranger, which made Benjen anxious before a word was said. Maester Eamon sat near the brazier with his milky eyes turned toward the heat and his thin hands folded. The old man's blind gaze had a way of watching you harder than sighted eyes. Cotter says there's smoke on Skirling Pass, Mormont said without preamble. Dennis says there's scree on the ice river. You say there's something in the highland. I say I want clear taxes and a summer due that came owing before half these boys were born. I brought nothing but the world, Benjen said. I didn't care to leave what little else there was beyond the wall. Mormont's face crumpled at the eyes and then smoothed again. You found no sign of your missing men. Benjen shook his head. He did not speak of the prints that followed and the snow that swallowed and the sense of a face where the air thinned. We will not find them, he said. Not alive. Mormont's hand lifted and fell on the map. Then we burn their names, he said softly, and eat. You look like a man chewed by birds. He glanced at Eamon, and the old man smiled a little. Hungry men make poor prophets, Eamon said gently. Sit, Benjen. Warm your hands. Tell us what you did find. Benjen sat. He told them as much as could be told quickly, and then he told them about Craster and the child. Mormont's face did not change as he listened. Eamon's did once. There is a kind of mercy that looks like fire, the old man said. It does not feel like mercy to those who have stood too near it, but it may be the only sort that leaves anyone alive. What you did will have a cost, Mormont said, when Benjen finished. That man's house has stood because he has made it stand. The shield that keeps him is made of something we none of us would eat. Now you've taken the taste from his mouth. That kind of hunger goes hunting. It hunted already, Benjen said. Mormont drew a breath, then nodded. A bear making peace with a fallen tree. Aye, well, we will light the fires. He rubbed his hand over his face. And we will talk about this later. Word from Eastwatch? Benjen asked. Cotter says he has boats he will not sail, Mormont answered sourly. Men on the coast are speaking of empty holds and the smell of bad fish. He's a brave man who trusts the sea when the wind blows strange. He thinks something moves inshore. He thinks the dead make no waves. The dead make plenty, Benjen said quietly. They just don't care when they break. He looked at Eamon. Maester, there will be a time when you will think me mad, and I will need you to call me sound. Eamon smiled again. I have been called worse than a man's witness, he said, and I have listened to snow longer than most men live. The snow tells the same story in summer and winter. Men don't. That night Benjen walked the switchback, rode up the wall with John and Ghost and a half-dozen other brothers. Their faces pinked and raw as if they'd been slapped with a leather glove. The wind knifed and the stars burned like nail-heads hammered into the skull of the sky. At the top the world widened into white and black and a line between. John looked out with a hunger that did not abate in cold or darkness. It is all a story until you stand on it, he said, wonder licking at his edges. It's all a story afterward, too, Benjen answered. I've stood on it a long time. The story it tells is always the same. If the line falls, the things behind it step forward. They lit torches in iron brackets along the wooden walkway and poured oil from heavy jugs into great iron pans set upon stands. Flames rose in their bowls without much show, the light swallowed and thrown back by ice. A horn sounded down the wall toward Eastwatch, a single long note that meant only men moving, only night and routine. Men called to each other by name and ranked by habit. The world held. It did not hold for long. Mormont called the great ranging a week later. It was not as great as he wished. Nothing was. The watch was thin as a starving goat, and winter made it thinner. Benjen did not argue, not about the ranging, which was needed, but about its arm. No circles, he said over the map, tapping with one finger. No wandering like men who expect to come across a thing by staring at the place where it isn't and waiting for it to look back. We go by the fist. We seize it and fortify hard. We burn what dies, living or no. We hold there and send. Fingers, not hands. Fingers get bitten off, Sir Alistair said, sour as a rotten apple. Hands get swallowed, Benjen said. I prefer to count after. Mormont listened, grunted, listened again, and grunted again. You ride with us, he told Benjen. If I leave you at the wall, you'll brood and move men in ways I won't like. I'll brood and move men with you, Benjen said, and Mormont's beard hid his smile. They rode under a sky the color of old tin and winds that came in teeth. Men watched them from the ramparts with the helpless fear of those who wish words were wolves. The wagons creaked. The ravens watched from their loft. John was not with them. Mormont had set him to the Lord Commander's service for more than show. It stung the boy like a thorn lodged under a nail. John could not see the whole of what was asked of him, no young man could, but he would. Benjen said as much to Mormont when they shared a skin of something sharp by a dead fire that first night. Will he see it in time? Mormont asked. For what? For the work, Mormont said. For living through it. Seeing is what keeps a man alive. He'll see, Benjen said. But if the seeing doesn't break him, the not seeing might. They reached the fist, a ring of ancient earth and stone like a closed hand. They made it teeth. They dug pits and set stakes and built fires in circles and more circles beyond. They stacked oil and stones and sodden green wood that would smoke like a sea of ghosts. They sent their fingers out, and the fingers touched ice and old bones and the same thin air that had always lain on this land. When the first dead thing came, an elk that walked slow as a terrible dream, its eyes shining like coins beneath ice, they did as they had agreed. They ringed it and burned it. It screamed with no throat and died again. Mormont watched the fire with his jaw working and said nothing. At night, the wind learned a new language, or maybe it remembered one. Men woke with their hands clenched upon their knives. Corin Halfhand came in from the west with frost in his beard and a look that said all the stories were on their way to becoming a single story, and he did not like its shape. They feel us, he told Benjen without greeting. The boy you sent with the black hair and the white wolf. John, Corin blinked. He will be something if he survives his lessons, he said. Make sure the lessons don't teach him to die well. We have too many men here ready to die well and not enough ready to live badly. Benjen laughed, the sound like a bark in cold. Can you teach him? I can teach him how to like me, Corin said. That will keep him alive long as anything. The dead came on the 6th night. The horn blew once and again, and men ran at its call like blood to a wound. Benjen had seen battle under summer sun where men shouted about glory and looked toward home when they fell. This was not that. This was the world trying to empty itself of men and men trying to make themselves heavy enough to stay in place. They fired the pits as they had meant to. They kept the dead on their far side with flame. Men swung at things that had once been men and moaned when they recognized a face, and Benjen shouted at them to burn those faces and think later. The cold light poured over the crest of the fist like water and ran down to meet them. The eyes in that light were not eyes at all, but they watched. When dawn came, Dawn was gray and far, and the snow where the dead fell was a solid crust of black and ash. Benjen counted. He always counted. They had lost fewer men than they might have under a commander who did not expect the worst to be bigger than his fear of being wrong. But loss measured itself from you outward and not the other way around. Each body burned left him a size smaller inside his armor. They did not linger. They did not attempt another night on that hill. They lit the last line of fires and made a wedge with their riders and cut south toward the river, their tired horses' hearts as hot as the oil in their bellies. Corin took a small party north and west to draw off what would follow. He asked for John and Ghost with a glance. Benjen nodded once and felt the pain of it punch him under the ribs. John's eyes burned. He said nothing because Corin had told him not to say anything except when he could not help it. Benjen did not hug him. He took John's shoulder for a moment and closed his fingers. It felt like grasping a branch before you step out into a ravine. They won clear. They came to the wall like men coming to a remembered dream and found they had not dreamed it at all. A horn sounded from Eastwatch that was not the horn most men had ever heard. It was a thin, high cry like a hawk's, and it meant something on the water. Mormont looked at Benjen. "We'll count again later," he said. "For now we breathe." The news came in a scatter. Raiders gathering, wildlings coiling into a rope, Mance Raider weaving it from the knots and loose ends and stubborn, proud hearts of the free folk. He had thrown off his black years ago, and the watch had tutayed over it because it looked like a small betrayal in a world where men betrayed large without manner. Benjen had thought then, and thought now, that Mance had broken the wrong vow in a world with too many wrong vows. He had known Mance a little. He knew what kind of man he was. Clever, kind when it suited him and when it didn't. Tired of walls. They sent ravens to Winterfell. They sent ravens to the south. The south would not care until the north fell into its lap, drunk with its own wounds, and then it would blame the north for bleeding on its carpets. Benjen did not waste much thought on it. He would have wasted none, but for John. John grew, not in height that he had already, but in the way a blade grows, thinning to an edge. He took Samwell Tarly under his wing, not for show and not without complaint. He did not stand silent when Alistair Thorne made jest of fat boys, which brought him trouble. He did not learn to hold his tongue in the yard so much as learn when to spend it elsewhere. When a raven from Winterfell brought news that broke a piece of him and left the rest ringing, Benjen spoke his name the first night after and said, "Your father hated the man he had to be in the south. Hate is a hard teacher. Learn something softer." John said, "I dreamed of a weirwood beside a winter river, and a woman's voice telling me to be still." "Dreams are wind," Benjen said, though he remembered a face beneath a tower that did not belong in any season. Mance's host coiled toward the wall. It was not one host but many knots. A vast cloth of men and women and children and animals and sledges and giants and old stories dragged into daylight. Cotter Pike sent word that he had seen fire on the sea near Hardhome and then nothing else. The ravens from his rookeries came back with broken feathers or did not come back at all. Dennis Mallister at the Shadow Tower wrote of shadows moving with no men to cast them. The nights lengthened by minutes that felt like hours. Men stared too long into cook fires and forgot the taste of salt on their tongues. When Mance sent envoys, he chose men Benjen had ridden with in younger years. One had the scars of a bear's swipe like a hand upon his face. Another had a child on his hip who had John's solemn look with more dirt in it. They came with words and a flag sewn from pieces of cloaks and skins and a torn Lannister banner bleached nearly white. "We're coming through," the first man said. "We will come whether you open or whether you fire the tunnel and make yourselves tombkeepers. If you open, we come as friends. If you close, we come as the tide." Benjen met them in the Lord Commander's tower with Mormont and Bowen Marsh and Othel Yarwick and Maester Eamon listening with his head tilted. "You call yourself king," Marsh said sullenly, taking offense where he could because he could not find it elsewhere. "We know no kings north of the neck." The man with the bear scars laughed. "You know kings when they ride to take your bread," he said. "We're not here to be kings. We're here to live. What rides behind you will not stop at life," Benjen said. "It will ask for more." I will pay with wood and walls and men. I will count the cost. Your king knows this. Our king knows what you know, the man said carefully. He was a brother once. He knows what the world looks like from your side. What does it look like from his? Benjen asked, and the man shrugged. Less walls, more wind. Benjen went atop the wall to think. Thinking with wind in your mouth did something to conclusions. It sharpened them or wore them to nubs. John joined him without being asked. Ghost put his paws on the merlin and looked north with the attentive love a wolf keeps for anything that moves. I'd open the gates, John said before Benjen asked. I'd open them and count only the ones who came in, not the ones who might do harm once they had shelter. And the harm they might do? Benjen asked. What harm have they not suffered? John said. It will not be new to them. It will be new to us. Newness is often what hurts worst. He looked at the white waste. I hear a sound sometimes in the night, he admitted, cheeks pinking not from the cold. It isn't the wind or the creak of the timbers. I hear, he broke off. It sounds like a horn a long way off. You hear what we have all heard, Benjen said. Learn its measures. When it blows 3 times, you will not ask what it means. He did not say what the 4th might be. He did not know if there was a 4th. Mormont died 2 months later, stabbed not by wildlings, but by a brother with a coward's thirst. But not at Craster's. Benjen had burned that house to ash and sent the women with escort to Eastwatch days after the ranging returned. The Lord Commander's seal on his orders and his own blood drying on his knife from the fight that permitted it. Men who would have drunk bitterness into murder had no hearth in which to stew their failure. Jor Mormont died in his bed, a winter sickness taking his heart as he cursed being too warm and too weak. He held Benjen by the collar and spat into his face when breath would come. Tell my son, he rasped. Benjen said he would, knowing Jorah Mormont would not listen to anything north of honor and women and the sea. Mormont died with his hand in Benjen's black, and men who did not weep because they did not know how stood quiet enough to be decent. The choosing was ugly, as such things are when men find themselves bumping elbows over greatness they didn't expect to have. Cotter Pike wanted the chair for a week and a day, and so did Dennis Mallister. Then both wanted the other man never to have it, and the weeks lengthened. Bowen Marsh progressed from apple in a cellar to apple turned to liquor and poured on the floor. Alistair Thorne made speeches to men who preferred their orders shorn of his voice. Samwell Tarley, sweating and stubborn, whispered behind hands and in corners and brought men together who did not know they could fit in the same room. Benjen stood aside until the last moment, and then he stepped forward because someone had to fill the space. He did not want to be Lord Commander, but want had nothing to do with it. If you will have me, he told the hall, I will bore you with lists and stacks of wood and numbers on paper and the dull tasks that keep my men breathing. I will make you hate me when I count too tightly. I will put our dead to fire faster than some of you will bear. I will open gates and then close them until your knuckles are white. I will ask you to trust a Stark when there are fewer Starks than winters left to survive, and I will not ask it sweetly. It was not a speech made for charm. Men who had loved him less than the idea of him looked at him with more affection afterward, because honesty is a salve even when it stings. He received the cloak he had worn in all but name. Maester Eamon tied the clasp. His fingers trembled. Bind it tight, Benjen said gently. It will not be as tight as the cold, Eamon said, and smiled again, that ghostly smile that made him seem for a moment a boy behind his clouded eyes. He sent for Mance then. He did not invite him into Castle Black, but met him between the first and second switchback, where ice and stone shared the wind. Mance came cloaked in patchwork and pride. There was a little gray at his temples that had not been there when he had danced a reel in the common room 20 years ago. Stark, he said by way of greeting. I'd hoped you'd be the one, not because I expect mercy, mind. I know better than to ask mercy from a man with the weight of ice on his back. For the men, not for you, Benjen said. For the children, for the women who can carry wood twice, for the boys who can learn drills faster than fear. Give me the keys, Mance said. I'll keep order. You'll keep your people, Benjen answered. I'll keep the order. We do it together. You bring me names. I give them shelter and food and work under my men. We hold back those who won't take our law. I'll hang them if we must." "That will sit ill with you," Mance said, surprised. "Everything does," Benjen said, and something like a laugh passed between them, thin and hard as glass. They shook hands. Mance's palm was rougher than he remembered. Wolves and kings share their calluses. The free folk came through in tens and scores and hundreds. Some spat as they passed under the ice. Some wept. A few knelt, then sprang to their feet and pretended to be tying their laces. Tormund Giantsbane slapped Benjen on the back so hard he coughed and declared it good to meet a crow with guts enough to make trouble when trouble was already in the room. Val regarded him with a gaze as clear as a winter stream and said she did not admire men for doing what sense demanded, and then softened it with a nod. Ygritte cocked her head and told Jon he knew nothing, and Jon's mouth did something complicated that surprised them both, and their lives tangled the way vines do on a ruin. Stannis Baratheon came like iron the season after, bringing with him a red woman and a fire you could not warm your hands at unless you burned. His banners looked wrong against the snow. He saw the wall and saw a throne hidden in it, or perhaps the other way around. He came to Benjen as to a man he would not bow to or break but might bend. "Swear me fealty," Stannis said at once. "Do it now, and I will give you the North. You are the last Stark north of the Neck with any right to say what that means." "I have a brother," Benjen said. It startled even him, that present tense, the way it fell from his mouth smooth as ice. Ned was gone, head severed from life and honor in a place where honor was a word for fools, and yet Benjen had a brother still in the boy with the white wolf. More than that, he had brothers under his roof and on his wall and in his ground. "I have sworn another oath, your grace." "You were not made for a vow to last your whole life," Stannis said, surprising him. "Better to swear to a man who makes it worth its pain." "Better to swear to the world," Benjen said. "And better to be called stubborn than faithless. We will fight beside you. We will treat with your enemies when they are ours. We will not bend the watch to any crown." Melisandre watched him with eyes as bright as embers under ash. "There is a boy in your shadow," she said. "His wolf has no voice but speaks louder than yours. He is fire the snow fears." "I've seen snow fear a fire," Benjen said. "It melts and is made water and flows where it would not go. It is still snow in the end when it freezes again." He did not look at Jon. He did not need to. He could feel his nephew at his shoulder like another shadow, like a second, colder breath. He made Jon first ranger. Men muttered. Bowen Marsh said the boy had more heart than sense, and sense was what made a man count the flower and not the crows. Othel Yarwick shrugged and said a boy who could hold a sword like that might as well be sent where holding it mattered. Sam turned pink and stammered and said Jon had a good heart, and Benjen said that was not the question and made it the answer anyway. Jon took to command like a wolf to snow. He was not perfect, and that made him better than many men who thought they were. He made mistakes and then learned from them faster than pride would have liked. He rode north with Tormund to the ragged promise of Hardhome, because the free folk begged for it in the way men beg when begging is all that stands between them and the end. Benjen did not forbid it. He counted the men he could afford and the ones he could not, and he made himself poorer and sent Jon anyway. The sea did smell wrong. The waves broke with a hollow undernote you felt in your teeth. The cliff bones were black. They hauled mothers and children and old men with their stories to boats that had no room for stories anymore, and the water shook even on days without wind. When the dead came down the shore, they came like a piece of night torn loose, and there were eyes in it. Jon stood and swung Longclaw until his arms would not, and Tormund bellowed like a lord of bears, and men died singing and not singing, and the boats shoved off half empty because fear will make you pitch half your life into a fire to feed it. Jon came back thinner and older and written with ash. He looked at Benjen and did not say, "We lost more than we saved." He said, "We saved some. That is the only sum that ever matters," Benjen said. The letter came pink with wax and madness. Ramsay Bolton wrote with a hand that did not know ink could be used for anything but harm. He demanded what he could not name and swaggered about what he could not earn, and he dared them to step 1 foot into the south, so that he might cut it off and feed it to his dogs while telling it what a good foot it had been. John looked at the page and saw Sansa in snow that wasn't hers. He saw a girl called Arya that wasn't his sister, and his grip whitened. "We go," he said, and half the hall stirred because they thought they saw the flesh under the black and liked the color. "We do not," Benjen said. He did not raise his voice. The hall quieted anyway. "We will not be flung from this wall to bang like a bell for the tune of a bastard. If there is a girl in a castle who can be saved, she will not be saved by our breaking the only oath that keeps this castle standing." The quiet broke like a thin crust under a heavy boot. Men shouted. Bowen Marsh's face went the color of fallen snow and then blazed red. "He has broken it already?" Marsh said, thrusting a shaking hand toward the wildlings in their corner, toward Tormund eating stew with a contentment the hall envied. "He is giving our bread to the foe, our walls to the foe, our women to the foe. Our foe is the cold," Benjen said. "Our foe is the dark. Our foe sends ravens without feathers. If you still think your foe is a man who eats a different stew, you have not been listening to anything but your own chewing." He looked at John. "You will not go. You will stay. If there is a rescue, it will be done quiet and crooked." Quiet and crooked meant Mance Rayder pulled from a cage and masked in bones to go where his pride never would have permitted him. It meant fires lit on certain nights on certain hills. It meant letters written by hands that would never admit to the writing. It meant a girl who was not a Stark pulled from a pit and made a person again, and a dozen dead besides, and a castle that was not yet ready to fall, learning the sound it might make when it did. Maester Aemon died on a day that smelled like spring and tasted like winter. He went with a sigh teach. It made men cry who had forgotten how. Benjen sat with him until the breath left. The old man turned his face toward the brazier and said a name no one else heard, and then he said, "Open the window, Benjen. Let me hear the ravens." And when the window was open and the ravens threw their black shapes against the sky, he smiled and was gone. That night the wind changed. It came from the far north and carried with it something like the taste of raw iron. The wall groaned in its sleep. Men who had not spoken to one another in 5 years shared wine. Ghost lay with his head on John's foot and stared at nothing. Benjen walked the length of the wall from Eastwatch to the Shadow Tower over the next week, in his head if not in his feet. He thought of wood and oil and stones and the men who could throw them. He thought of the names he kept and the names he had burned and the empty places between. He counted the children. He counted how many loaves a day it took to keep a giant from fainting. He counted nights with no sleep as if he could stack them like firewood. The dead came on the last night of the long moon. The horns blew 3 times until no one could hear. The snow moved and then it stood up. Fire took and did not give enough. Men fought until their arms were rope and their eyes bled tears they did not feel freeze on their cheeks. John's blade sang, and where it struck something that ought never to have had a throat screamed a sound that left taste like old pennies. Sam thrust up with a black glass dagger and gasped when the thing he stabbed shattered like ice dropped on stone. Tormund swung a mace that had once been the axle of a cart and laughed until he sobbed, calling for his sons who were far away by design and not by fortune. The Red Woman made light with her hands and muttered in a language that might have been prayer and might have been a contract. One took 20 arrows into his body and kept walking and then knelt down very slowly as if to pray and did not rise. Benjen was everywhere and nowhere. He did what commanders do in such nights. He cut what must be cut. He stamped where he saw a trickle of fear running toward a crack. He set his hand on shoulders that would have turned and shoved them forward. He killed twice and saved 5 and lost 27 and did not see any of them clearly until dawn made the dead look like men again and not like a language he did not understand. He broke his own orders and rode to the Shadow Tower when the horn there sounded thin and wrong, and there he found Dennis Mallister with half his beard scorched off and 3 teeth missing and the look of a man who has chewed on a storm and found it not much to his liking but edible. He left 30 men and took 20 and scolded himself for thinking numbers could be made into a shield. The castle black the gate held. It held because Donal Noy died holding it, his single arm making more weight than many men's too. It held because Gren and a clutch of boys who should have been asleep under quilts stood in the tunnel and recited words under their breath that were not a ward and then made them one. It held because Benjen had forced men to pile stones where no one thought stones would be needed, and because Othel Yarwick had cursed him while he did it, and because when the stones fell they fell at a time and not at random. It held because the wall was old and stubborn. It held because the dead do not know how to be patient the way ice knows. When dawn came it was grayer than any Benjen had ever seen. The dead, which had come like a black sheet, went back in strips, tugged by some wind he could not feel. The living stood and then sat down as if reminded their knees bent. One lay where he had knelt. Tormund walked to the giant and leaned his head against his flank and made a noise like a bullfrog breaking. Jon stood with Longclaw's point in the snow, both hands still clenched around it. His breath coming in small, surprised scoops as if he had forgotten how. Ghost shook himself head to tail and sent a flurry of rhyme glittering, and then put his nose to Benjen's palm and held it there, hard. Men brought bodies. Names were called. A pile of wood as high as a house was thrown together in hours that felt like years. Benjen spoke the words he always spoke and thought the things he never said and lit the pyre himself as a wind rose to devour it. The smoke went straight up and then bent in a single motion like a tree in hail. Maester Aemon's voice lived in his memory saying, "There is a kind of mercy that looks like fire." He watched the light in men's eyes change from the reflection of that fire to something of their own. It was not hope. It was something without a name, tougher and harder to burn. Stannis answered their horn before the week ended and brought men who had not seen snow enough to know how to fear it and men who had seen too much ice to fear anything but hunger. He brought also a letter with a seal that made men in the south sit up in their chairs and look northward for news they never cared for before. He made demands. Benjen made refusals with a politeness that made refusal look like hospitality. Melisandre looked at Jon long enough to make his skin prickle, and then smiled in a way that made Benjen want to put a mantle of iron around the boy. She smiled at Benjen too, with a kind of respect that said he reminded her of iron that had learned to hold a heat without cracking. "I saw a figure upon the wall last night in the flame," she told him in private, when the world had ceased its ringing for a few breaths. "He was a shadow of a man stretched long by the fire's light. He had no face I could see. He had a blade that was darkness. He walked the switchback and did not leave a print." "Was he walking toward me or away?" Benjen asked. She blinked. "Does it matter?" "Yes," Benjen said, and left her without explaining further. It mattered because one kind of shadow you can let pass you and another you cannot let into your house. In the days that followed, men did what men do after the first chorus of a disaster. They told stories about how they themselves had made the difference and how their neighbor had failed, forgetting to count. They wished to pull their griefs close and make them into coats, and they wanted others to see the shape of those coats and admire them. They wanted to fall in love, because the heart's answer to death is to pound harder. They wanted to sleep. They wanted to eat. They wanted to go home or make one where they stood. Benjen let them do much of this and stopped them where he had to. He clamped down on theft mercilessly and forgave 3 men their violence because he could tell where it had come from. He threw 2 men from the wall because you cannot teach mercy with weakness, and he wrote in the ledger by candlelight afterward with the steady hand of a man who knows what he has done cannot be mended but can be remembered in a tidy hand. He stood with Jon at dusk on a day when the sky made a trick of light and broke all its mirrors at once, so that the wall seemed to glow from within. "I almost broke," Jon said, looking at his hand as if it had just now become his. "If I had, it would have made no difference to the dead at all. They don't care if you break. They only care if you stop. That's the trick," Benjen said. Not breaking. Not stopping." "You didn't stop," Jon said, with a boy's awe and a man's gratitude. "I didn't," Benjen said. He thought of a bundle in hide and a door and a hand grabbing a knife and the way a baby's breath rakes through a throat that had not yet decided to use it. He thought of his brother's children and their ghosts. He thought how little the world cares if you keep your promises, and how much more you should for that. The next winter storm took 3 men from the Shadow Tower in a drift that swallowed them quicker than a lie. A wind blew for 2 days in one direction and 1 day in another, as if two weathers were fighting. The ravens came and went, and one morning a bird with white feathers in its tail sat on the sill of Benjen's room and would not be shooed. He gave it a crumb of bread and told it a story of a boy and a girl and a summer day in a god's wood, and it listened with its head cocked and then flew away. Later that day Tormund came to him grinning with a missing tooth newly noticed and said they had found a way to cut more peat from the bog without losing men in it, and Val told him the women would make more boots than they had promised, and Bowen Marsh handed him a ledger with the look of a man who had decided to live long enough to be embarrassed by earlier attitudes. "Your mother would have liked you up here," Marsh blurted, shocking himself. Benjen smiled and said, "My mother liked me anywhere but the kitchen." And they both snorted in a way that made them momentarily young. When the night was clear enough, he would go to the top of the wall alone with a fur and a bit of bread and sit on the edge with his legs over and watch for the aurora, that pale green river that sometimes flows where no rivers can. He did not always think when he sat there. He could not always bear to. Sometimes he listened for a woman's laugh he had not heard since he was a boy and let himself admit he loved a brother with the kind of love that made one a worse man to the rest of the world if you didn't watch it. Sometimes he looked at the far dark line on the southern horizon and tried to imagine what it would be like to leave the wall and not look back, and every time he found he could not. The wall had made him into the man he had to be. He did not hate it for that. He knew it had not chosen him either. Over the next months, Benjen Stark kept careful count and watched his men and his enemies and the weather as if they were all three the same and all three different. He told Mance no when the king beyond the wall wanted to test a path through the ice that would have killed 20 more than it saved. He told Stannis yes when the king wanted would cut from a stand that would grow back. He told Melisandre nothing when she asked him for a name to burn. In the end, she gave him a look that said she knew where his fires lay and knew also she could not light them with her god. He went to sleep that night with his hand on the hilt of a knife he had not needed in years. He did not fall asleep quickly. That too was a count he kept. The dead did not come again for a season. That made the living bolder, which meant harder in some places and softer in others. And Benjen spent more time than he liked smoothing men where they splintered. He watched Jon learn to answer insults with humor because he found it kept him from stabbing men he needed. He watched Sam read until the candles burned down to puddles and then stagger to the rookery to apologize to birds he had not wronged. He watched Gilly's baby grow rounder and louder and saw how men's faces changed when the tiny boy reached for their beards. He watched the giants bury one of their own with a solemnity that humbled everyone who saw it. He watched a girl who had never spoken loudly barter for sausage with a voice you could hear across the yard. One evening snow began to fall in flakes so large they looked like rags. Jon stood under them and stuck out his tongue, and Ghost tried to catch the falling pieces in his mouth and missed every one and pretended it was a game he had invented in order to avoid shame. Benjen leaned in the tower door to shelter his pipe and watched. "Why do you let the free folk keep their ways?" Bowen Marsh asked, joining him as if simply happening to stand there. "They set up their tents inside the walls. They sing those songs. Because walls fail," Benjen said. "Because when they do, a man who knows how to sing and light a fire and melt snow will live longer than one who knows how to scowl and count." Marsh opened his mouth, then closed it. "You think things will fall," he said. "It wasn't a question. I think we live by holding together what we can until we can't," Benjen said. "Then we try something else that holds." Marsh swallowed. He looked as if he wanted to say thank you and would rather bite off his tongue. "You've changed," he muttered instead. "I have," Benjen answered. "So have you." That night he dreamed of a tower and a storm and a girl's laughter. He woke to the sound of a horn. Once, twice, then 3 times, echoes beating against the ice like a heart. He rolled out of bed with his knife in his hand before he was truly awake and went to the door bareheaded, hair wet with sweat that froze at the ends the moment he stepped into the hall. Men were already running. Ghost shot past him like a speck of night, and for a moment all things that had ever happened lay on top of each other like stacked glass, and he could see each clearly and not at all. They fought again. He could tell you how they fought, but you already know. The dead come in their numbers and their patience, and the living look small against them. We make a stand somewhere because something must stand or the world will sit down and be done with itself. Brothers die in their black. Wildlings die with furs on their backs and curses on their lips or blessings if they remember any. Men who once would have killed each other over a bag of grain fall back to back and get bloody together. A red woman's hands glow in a way that makes you want to warm your palms and then makes you think of burning. A king with a frown like a cliff takes a spear in his side and doesn't notice until his man pulls him from his horse and tells him he's dead, and he says, "Not yet." In the worst of it, Benjen saw a figure at the edge of the firelight, not close enough to claim and not far enough to forget. A shape that made the heat between him and it feel like something alive. It did not walk like a man. It did not drift like a ghost. It moved as if the world belonged to it. He stepped toward it, and the thing cocked its head, a bird unbothered, and then it moved its hand in a motion that seemed to squeeze the air. The flame in the nearest brazier withered and spat and went small. Men screamed, not at the enemy, at the light. Benjen did not think. He threw oil at the ground and a torch after it, and fire leapt in a second wall. The thing turned its head, and the blue in its eyes narrowed, and for a moment Benjen didn't see a monster but saw instead the clarity of ice in a deep pool, and the way it makes you want to step forever into it and never be warm again. Benjen! John's voice cut that sweetness like a blade. Benjen backed up, breath heaving, and the thing on the edge of the firelight did not follow. It stood and watched and then was gone, leaving a place that took longer to grow warm again than could be explained. They held. When dawn came, they held. Men stumbled to the yard to drink water that tasted of ash and brine. Someone laughed that high, uncontrollable laugh that follows terror, and others followed because it is a language as old as any. Benjen found a quiet corner and sat for the length of one pipe, the smoke hoarding its own warmth in his mouth and nose. He had the face of the thing in his mind like a coin pressed into wax. He knew it would not fade with time. He did not want it to, not entirely. Men must keep something in their heads to remind them what their hands are for. John found him. He stood awkwardly for a heartbeat as if his limbs had outgrown some older plan of his body. Ghost pushed his nose under Benjen's hand and huffed. "I thought you'd die," John said, like a boy again, like a man with all his masks cracked and discarded. "I thought so too," Benjen admitted. "We both were wrong." John blew out a breath that left him slumped. "They'll come again," he said. "Of course," Benjen said. "So will we. Some men." John began, and then he stopped. The word men had to do too much work for him now. He meant Bowen and Othel and the nameless boys who spilled stew and then apologized as if they'd spilled a life. He meant Mance and Tormund and Val and the dozen giants left who had learned to drink ale without smashing cups. He meant Stannis with his spear wound and his pride patched with Melisandre's assurance. He meant Sam with his nose blistered and his hands shaking because he had killed a thing you shouldn't be able to touch. He meant Gilly and her son and the sound a child makes when it sees snow begin again. He meant all of them. "Some men want to go south," he managed finally, "to fight in a war with names." Benjen nodded. "Some will go. They will die in ways we understand better. We'll go on with the numbers left. We will leave the wall sometimes to do what we must, and we'll come back more often than we want. There will be days with no horns. Those will be the dangerous ones." John looked at him, a question there that had lived since he had first seen the black cloaks and recognized a road prettier in snow than in summer. "Would you, if it were offered, take Winterfell?" he asked suddenly. "Would you trade the wall for that?" Benjen smiled, unexpected and then not. He thought of a little boy running through the snow toward a gray stone tower, his mother calling. He thought of a lord with too much weight on his shoulders and a gentleness he could afford less every year. He thought of a hall where wolves howled in tapestries. He shook his head. "No," he said. "I have a castle that needs me more. Winterfell will outlive us all. The wall may not." John made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite a sob. "You make it sound like a person," he said. "It is," Benjen said. "She is. He is. The wall is something men made and then fell in love with and then forgot to care for like a living thing. I don't propose to forget." They stood then and looked at the ice that rose like an impossible thought into the sky. The sun made small pearls of light along its face where imperfections offered themselves. A raven sat upon the merlin and cocked its head at them and said nothing. The day promised more cold and more duty and more bone-deep weariness, which meant it kept its promises better than most days in the south. Benjen Stark lived. He commanded the night's watch as if it were a child left to him at his brother's request, and also a god that would not be pleased with anything he did, and also a battered wall that wanted only to be kept standing one day more. He did not always find the right words and did not always keep the wrong ones out of his mouth. He counted more dead than he could remember by name some nights and remembered the names he could not count on others. He watched a boy he loved turn into a man he needed, and he let the man be himself so the boy would not die. He endured the red woman's flames and the ice's breath and the king's demands and the free folk's pride and his own failures and the deafness of the south. He kept the ledgers. He kept the fires. He kept the gate. He kept the promise. On the day the sky broke open in green and rose and the aurora poured over the wall like a river you could not drink. He sat alone on the edge, his legs dangling, and thought of the bundle he had once taken from a man's arms in a ring of smoke and starlight. He thought of Lionel's hand, light on his hair, and a voice telling him to be still. He thought of Ned's eyes. He thought of a boy with a white wolf who would never be still long enough to become stone. He took a breath so cold it made him cough and then laugh at himself for coughing. He touched the ice with his hand and felt nothing. That was the point. You make your heat yourself up here. You make it and you share it and you do not stop. The cold is patient. Duty must be more so. Below, the yard hummed with the quiet energy of men who have toiled ere way past exhaustion and come to the small plateau beyond it where work does itself and you merely guide it. Tormund was telling a young man not to lift a barrel like that unless he wanted to be called crooked for the rest of his life. Val was cutting leather with care that made it seem quiet. Bowen Marsh was arguing about flour. Othel Yarwick was swearing at a beam that refused to sit straight and then coaxing it with a hand a lover would envy. Samwell Tarly was reading with his lips moving, and when somebody asked him what he was muttering, he smiled sheepishly and said, "A word I don't know yet, but I will." Ghost lifted his head and looked up at Benjen as if to say, "I am here even when you forget I am," and then lay it down again. John came out into the yard in his black and his fur and his skin that had learned what weather means. He lifted his face to the light and closed his eyes. Benjen climbed to his feet and went down to add his body to the number of bodies that made the yard. He put his hand on the same beam Othel was cursing and felt the stubbornness in it. He put his shoulder under it and between them they moved it half an inch. Men cheered as if a war had been won. In a way it had. Wars are won that way, half inch by half inch. That night, when the fires burned low and men who would not sleep stood with their hands outstretched to think by their heat, he walked the parapet and listened for horns. He heard only the sound the wind makes when it has forgiven men for a night. He breathed. He kept breathing. There was more to come. There was always more. But there was also the finite fact of this breath, this fire, this night held, this wall standing. "Not tonight," Benjen said into that big, indifferent sky, and for that night at least the world agreed.